Hey guys, it's Dasha. Welcome back to my channel. Happy Friday. Welcome to another video. I really wanted to talk about some books I've read recently, so that's what we're doing today. This is another recent reads. I haven't done one of these in a while. Really, let's just get into it. I've still slowly been getting back into the groove of reading because I finished with classes back in April when I made the last recent reads, but I have been slowly working on an MRP, a major research paper. I have submitted it. I'm all done, so there'll be more reading coming up ahead, but I still managed to get through some things. I've sorted them into 4 categories. This is not everything I've read this year or since the last update, but just the things I kind of really wanted to talk about on the channel. So we have a couple of books I DNF'd, we've got some disappointing reads, we have some surprising reads, and we just have some really good books that I want to talk about. So let's get into it. Let's start with DNFs and get those out of the way so we can move on to more positive things. I specifically wanted to talk about 2 DNFs. These were books that I was fairly excited for, or at the very least there was a lot of hype for, and they just didn't really work for me. So the first one of these, I definitely felt a little bit less sure about going into it, but this is one of the very hyped ones, and that is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This was a book that just truly did not work for me in a lot of senses of the word. So this is a gender-bent retelling of one of China's emperors and kind of their rise to power, and it's historical fantasy, much more heavy on the history than the fantasy, which was fine in this case. My issue with this came down to how the pacing of it worked. The first part of the book, you're following really your main character. You're following her as her fate changes all at once, and she takes on the identity of her brother, who was supposed to go on to do great things. And she, he passes away, so she kind of takes on his identity and becomes him, and does, takes the path that he was supposed to take, basically. And this is a coming of age section of the story. This is really getting to know the character, watching her grow up, watching her be conflicted about who she is and who she is supposed to be and who she is kind of taking the role of. And it was really, really interesting. Like, I found that part was quite intriguing and I really enjoyed that. My issue was following that part, we get into a section where there's multiple POVs and several that I just didn't really care for. And it's crazy because this is not a long book, but I found the pacing just all of a sudden like dropped off. Like, it was non-existent. It was so boring once we got to those other POVs. And that maybe not be a super reasonable reason to DNF a book, but I just could not bring myself to care. I was buddy reading this with Robin and we both came to that exact same conclusion around the same time. It was once we got past that first part, we were intrigued with the first part. We were like, okay, this character's kind of interesting. There's something there. There's something going on that we would be kind of interested to follow in a whole story, in a whole duology, because there is a sequel. And just once we got to those multiple POVs, it was just like, wow, I could not care less. So it was a mutual decision to DNF the buddy read, and also just for ourselves. I think neither of us are really going to come back to it because there's kind of no point. Like, there was nothing keeping us there, which is disappointing considering how well the first part of the book went. Now, the other book I want to talk about that I DNF'd, I truly thought I was going to love based on how people talked about it, and even based on the first couple dozen pages I read. I really enjoyed the writing style. I really liked what I thought, like where it was going, but several things just piled up for me and I could not do it, and that's 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I am so disappointed, but I could not do it. This is the story of a fictional town in Colombia, and you're following a family who lives and dies in this town through several generations, and it's got a hint of the magical realism. I was not sure how I would like the magical realism, and it's decidedly odd, but it wasn't so bad that I didn't want to push through it at all. There was a couple reasons why I didn't like this. It felt too fairy tale-esque. I have an issue with books when they take on the tone of like fairy tales, wherein characters feel like they have no agency, and it just feels like you're being recounted like what they did, and it feels like there's like a big hand guiding them, like set pieces around a board, and it feels like they have no agency. It feels like they don't actually make decisions, like things just happen to them and they're there, and that's something I really dislike. There's also this weird attachment to relationships between young girls and older men, and I heard that this is an issue with this author in general, and I don't think it would be enough to fully stop me from this book if it was just like one instance or like a throwaway line. It felt repeated and like put on, and there's something about it that didn't sit right with me, and like I'm just not, that's not enjoyable to me. I'm sorry. And like you can criticize me for like not being, you know, like a classics reader, like I have to put up with things like that, but like at a certain point I don't have to, and in this case I just didn't really want to. The writing in this is spectacular. Like I thought it was just breathtaking. I really enjoyed it. There's things that are highlighted and underlined because I think they were beautifully written, and that's probably the strongest point of this book for me, for what I read. But I couldn't go through this, unfortunately. Let's do something slightly more positive. Let's move into surprising books, and we'll go back to disappointing and then finish off strong with the best books of the year so far. So a few surprising books, all of which are modern classics, oddly enough. A few things that I just wasn't really expecting to blow me away, but they did. The first one is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is a recent read. This is a really, really short novella about two men who are on their way to a ranch to find work during the Great Depression. They've been traveling together for a while. One of them is just like a very average man. The other is a little bit larger and a little bit slower in the mind. I don't know what the best way to put it, but he's just like, he was, I think, born like without oxygen and without enough oxygen to his brain or something. So he's like not quite there mentally, but he's really kind and really strong and just a really good person. That's not like the problem, but he just needs someone to help guide him, especially in more perilous situations. So these two men are on their way to a ranch for work, and along the way, tragedy strikes, I guess is the only thing I can still say. This is just one of those books you do kind of have to read for yourself. Now, I didn't do high school in the US, so I didn't have to read this in high school, but I know a lot of people did. And I'm still trying to figure out what like you would talk about in school with relation to this book, because the thing that I found interesting was that there wasn't a lot of themes to unpack. The good stuff in this book was really just the tone, the atmosphere, and the pacing of it. There's this sensation as you get like further into the book that you're barreling towards disaster, but you can't quite put your finger on when it'll happen or where it'll come from. And I think that was really, really interesting to read. This isn't a book that's like super deep or super complex, but I think from a writing craft standpoint, it's just really, really good. I didn't expect to like this as much as I did. I still don't fully know why I liked it as much as I did. It just was a really well crafted story, really well told story. Tragic, but also there's just something there that kind of stuck with me. Like, this is a book I feel is going to stick with me, and for some reason, yeah, it worked for me, and I can't tell you why fully, but I liked it. Another one that just like stuck its claws into me that I did not expect to like is The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. So this was a random pick from Instagram for my TBR game. This is a book that had been on my radar, but it's not something that I was immediately interested in reading. But I picked it up, and this blew me away. I really liked it. In this, you are mainly following a couple. The man is an incorrigible womanizer. He loves sleeping around. He just can't get enough of it. And even though he finds a woman who he loves and marries, he just can't really stop. And you're also following her trying to come to terms with that. But this is not a story about a relationship. This is not really being in their minds all the time. And it's not really like a story dissecting their feelings towards one another. This has a lot of philosophy in it about like the cyclical nature of life and kind of the frivolity of it all that I really, really liked. You start off with like a chunk of the beginning just being fully philosophy and kind of musing about life and how the state of existence is just, it's not a burden, it's really so freeing because you can do whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. And it's just a really interesting way of looking at it. And then you go through all these heavy things. This takes place partially in Prague during the Soviet invasion, or I guess occupation. And like, it doesn't feel like a light book. And that's kind of the point that he's trying to make, I guess, is that at the end of the day, like, your existence is really, really light and shouldn't have to be a burden. It's a very odd book. There's something about it that really appealed to me. I just know this is a book I'm gonna have to come back to over and over and over because there was so much in it that I'm not sure I fully got out of it. And it's just an absolutely, first of all, just like beautifully written. The philosophy was so well enmeshed in this, and it also just has this tone where like you have to keep reading even though nothing's really happening. things are happening out of order. You get told that something happens that you should really only find out at the end of the book, but you don't really feel like it's a spoiler. And I guess that kind of goes with the whole theme of like existence isn't really a burden. Things just happen, things just occur, and like it is what it is. It's such a weird book. I truly loved it so much. I can't fully explain either why, but it's one of those books that just really worked for me. And the less you know going into this, the better. I think the synopsis of like following a couple doesn't even do it justice, because it's really just a little world inside a book. The third and final book in this section that I found surprising was more so surprising because at the beginning I really didn't get the point of it, and then at a certain point of the book it hit me. I'm like, oh, I get it now. That is The Outsider by Albert Camus. So this is a classic of like philosophical fiction. It's a story of a man whose mother passes away, and he kind of doesn't react in a way that you would expect someone who is in grief to react. And he just kind of has a couple of misadventures, and you start to kind of contemplate the, I guess, theater of existence, like the way your existence is a performance, or at least it's considered to be, and what happens if you don't perform in the way you're expected to. It's just a really interesting, again, this is super short, like I encourage you to read it for yourself if you're remotely interested. It's weird. Like I don't think I fully got it. This is one of those books that I look forward to discussing with other people who have read it, because I want to know what they got out of it. Because what I got out of it, I don't know if it was the point based on how this book is often described, but to me that was the most interesting part of it. And to me the most interesting part was, again, that idea of, you know, life as a performance, the idea of, you know, if nobody saw you do something, did you actually even do it? That's what I got out of this. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that's my perception of this book. Yeah, I don't know, I didn't expect much from it, especially once it started. But once we got really into it, this blew me away. I was quite surprised by how much I enjoyed it. So that's definitely a surprising one so far for me. Let's get into a couple disappointments. These are controversial because these are beloved books, all three of them. There's two fantasy and a classic. Yeah, I'm gonna hurt some feelings, I can tell, but it's okay. Let's talk about them. So I'm gonna start with the classic because it's at the top of the pile. And this is, oh, I read this author before and I really loved him, and I thought this was going to be another slam dunk, especially because of how other people talk about this book. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I thought this was going to be 5 stars, or close. This is a story of a gay man living in Paris, basically just coming to terms with his sexuality, with who he is as a person, with who he loves. It's a tragic tale. It's an exploration of the self and of the kind of face we put on to others. The issue I mainly had with this was that I could not tell if we were supposed to be rooting for our main character and Giovanni, but unfortunately both of them were so horrifically misogynistic that I just couldn't really get past it. And I've had someone explain to me, at least their perspective, that, you know, obviously gay men suffer from misogyny as well, so they tend to project it onto women as a kind of defense. And it's not good enough for me, unfortunately. Doesn't work for me. And I also would have had a different feeling if the misogyny was, I guess, less prevalent and less violent, but it's the tone of it and the extent of it and the violent nature of it that made me deeply uncomfortable. I really appreciated the writing in this. I really appreciated the metaphors. Obviously, James Baldwin's an incredible author, and I imagine a lot of this is inspired by his own experiences, but there's a certain level of misogyny that I can take from classics, and this surpassed it. I apologize. This just was really hard to get through. I really appreciate the themes of this and the way they were presented, but it just wasn't enough for me to enjoy this, unfortunately. I found it kind of hard to get through, so that was really disappointing because I really liked the other James Baldwin I read, which was The Fire Next Time. So that hurt my feelings. So these next two, the two fantasy books, are beloved. When I say beloved, they are beloved. People go to bat for these books. One I found better than the other, so I'll start with that one. It's The Sword of Kaigan by Emma Wong. So I read this with Ray and Robin, They both seem to have liked it more than I did, and that's okay. I am happy for them. I found this just deeply underwhelming. This is supposedly a standalone. We'll get to that actually. This is a standalone set in this futuristic Japan-inspired country, but the place you're set in, the two characters you are following, a son and a mother, are living in a part of the country that's kind of old school. They don't really deal with technology that much. They are more inspired by like the samurais of old. That's how they live their life. They have a code, they have a way they dress, they train. They are very much like a samurai warrior society, and they're kind of separate from the rest of their empire that's like a futuristic Japan type of country. And so you follow these two characters. The son is about 14, I believe. He's going to school, and the mother has like a mysterious past. She used to be a really strong warrior, but in this kind of more conservative traditional culture, she's relegated to just being a housewife. I vastly preferred her point of view. I found her a much more interesting character, but that was not enough to kind of save this for me. I found the pacing of it a little bit odd. I'm frustrated by the fact that this was sold as a standalone when I found it deeply unsatisfying in the way that it wrapped up. The pacing was odd in that we hit our kind of what would normally be a climax, what felt like too early for me. And while I appreciate that a lot of the focus in this book was on the rebuilding and resolution of certain relationships, and normally I complain, you know, when books hit the climax and then after it feels like there's not enough time to resolve everything. This felt kind of the opposite to me, where we had so much time to resolve the conflicts that new ones arose. And that didn't feel satisfying to me because I was sold this as a standalone once again. I think it's impressive that Emma Long managed to publish this independently because it is quite impressive. It's a very large book in scope. It's very well written. It's clearly well edited. I think it's quite impressive what it managed to do. But I think, unfortunately for me, this just did not work. In certain ways, I feel like there was moments that were supposed to be super impactful and I did not feel for the characters. Other times I did. I'm not saying I was entirely emotionless, but I just found the way some of the characters were written did not make me want to feel for them very much. And others I wish we just spent more time with. So I felt like it was just an overall kind of unsatisfying read. I do feel like I will keep an eye out for what Emma Long does because I feel like there's something intriguing about their point of view as an author. Like I feel like there's definitely something there, but I feel like they need to hone their skills a little bit more because to me this just wasn't super successful. And that's why it's disappointing because this is just beloved. Like so many people love this and are so emotional about it and are so dedicated to it. But to me, it was just like a very okay experience. I don't want to call it mediocre because I don't think it was, that kind of implies bad, but it was just like very fine. That is not how I feel about this next book. I thought this was just truly mediocre to poor. And this is a book that's got like an incredibly high average rating on Goodreads, especially for a first book in the series. I expected to love this. I've read 4 of this author's other works and I enjoyed them. I did not like, I'm speaking my truth. I feel like this is a YouTuber apology moment. I'm speaking my truth. I did not like The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I feel some type of way about this. So this is the first book in what is slated to be a 10-book series set in this unique world. You're following these different characters. This is a really desolate world ravaged by storms, and all these different countries have their own politics going on, and there's fighting between them and also infighting, and kings are being assassinated and things are being stolen, and there's a lot going on, right? I thought this was such a poorly done introduction to the world that it did a disservice to its own world. I need a fucking drink for this. Okay. Brandon Sanderson is known for world building. Let's start there. This is the thing he apparently does the most positively in all of his books. I found it very poorly done in here. I felt like I was getting a encyclopedia of this world thrown at me, and it just was not an enjoyable experience to read. I feel like as a fantasy author, you have to know how to give tidbits of your world to your readers so that they know enough to situate themselves without being overwhelmed. And I found that the things that were very mundane about this world were being repeated to us over and over. Whether you want to call that foreshadowing, because I haven't read the other books in the series, fair enough. But it was frustrating when you're being told details about certain things over and over and over, whereas other things get mentioned once towards the beginning, and then come back as like a major plot thing later on, and you forgot about them already because they were not emphasized, because they were not, like, it's just a very imbalanced approach, I found. Things that I find he normally does less well, personally, are prose and characters. His prose I can usually forgive for being kind of mediocre, because normally there's a plot to move you along through the book. Because to me, it's like, okay, if the prose doesn't really carry you through the book, if you're not enticed to read more because the prose is good, at least there is a plot. There is something moving you along. That was not the case. There is no plot in this. And a lot of fans describe it as a prologue, but I don't even think that's fair. Like I said, this was just like an encyclopedia of Roshar being thrown at you. The other thing I find he doesn't typically do well are characters. And this is one of those instances where I agree and disagree. For Kaladin, he did Kaladin's introduction and character building incredibly well. But he's the only character that got that much attention and care in this book, and then others got very little care and attention. So of course I only really care about Kaladin. And I didn't find that fair to his other characters, because Jasna was one of my favorite characters. I guess this is more for the people who have like actually read the book now. Like, Jasna was a very interesting character, but I feel like she was relegated to the side. From the little few peeks I took of the next book, it seems like she has more of a role in the future ones, but I was just kind of frustrated because I felt like we were spending way too much time with people who didn't really matter. There's these interludes in between like parts of the book. I think there's 3 parts to the book, and there's 2 chunks of interludes, 3 chapters each, following completely different characters, meant to introduce different parts of the world. And I just felt like, I was like, I'm still struggling to wrap my brain around our characters that we're supposed to be following, that we're supposed to be involved with, that we're supposed to want to understand their motivations and their backgrounds. And now you're throwing these other people in different parts of the world in. And I get that you've built this expansive, beautiful world that has all these cool things, but please let me focus on what you're trying to introduce to me, which are your main characters and your main themes and your main plots. I'm fucking lost. So this was overall just such a frustrating experience. I could rant about this book for hours. I am scared, however, to make a standalone review because I saw what happened to Leanna from Leanna's library. She had to take down her review and put it behind a paywall because the fantasy bros got to her. I paid for her Patreon. I paid for her Patreon to go watch that video. And I thought, okay, there's probably like a few like shitty comments from like fantasy bros, but like it can't be that bad. They fucking like decimated the poor woman. And for what? For what? They went to like insult her intelligence. They questioned whether like she could basically read at that point. Like, they just completely tore her apart for laying out especially like very specifically what she did not like and why. It wasn't just like, I didn't really like this. It was like, here are my reasons. I thought this was not well done. You know, she reads a ton of fantasy. She's read more than I have. And like, I'm scared. Like, I'd love to make a standalone review because I have a lot more to say and I could probably structure it better, but I just don't really want to get insulted for having a different opinion. So I don't know. I'm going to think about it, but I have a lot to say. That's my main point. All that being said, I feel like I have to defend my stance now. I will be reading the sequel. One reason is because I do have the next 2 books in the series on my shelf, which in retrospect, I don't know why I did. Well, I do. I liked the other 4 books I'd read by him, so I thought I would like this. This is his magnum opus. The other thing, though, is that I feel like this is not a case of you have to read the next books in the series for it to be good, because that's usually where I have an issue. Like, when Sarah J. Maas fans say, like, oh, the first book in Throne of Glass is not that good, but, like, it gets so good after. It's like, yeah, but I don't even see where the nugget of goodness is in this. I'm not going to read several books for it to get good. I could see some nuggets of greatness in this. There's characters I liked. There's intriguing world building. I get that. There's enough for me there to be intrigued to continue. I also understand that this is just really meant to set the world up. While I don't think it was the best done, I can understand that that was the intention behind this book. So I'm willing to give it a shot when it comes to that. So I will be reading Words of Radiance. If I'm not feeling it, I'm not feeling it. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, this was incredibly disappointing. I truly expected so much better based on the average reviews it has, based on the way people talk about this as it is, like people who read it for the first time that are just enamored with it. Like, I just don't get it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's finish on a positive note. Here are 3 books that I just really, really liked this year so far. Books that just were good. That's all I have to say. So the first one, I didn't know really what to expect about. I wouldn't say it was like surprising because I had a feeling I might like this, but this is I Used to Be Charming, The Rest of Eve Babbitts by Eve Babbitts. This is a series of essays and stories that she wrote for various magazines and publications. Eve Babbitts is like if Joan Didion had a younger, raunchier sister who was a bit more sexed up, a little bit more cheetah print wearing, a little bit more rock star girlfriend aesthetic. And it works for her. It works really, really well. They both have such a charm to the way they write. They both write about California in the 60s and 70s, but where Didion has this gravity to her, Babbitts just kind of floats through life and things just kind of happen to her and with her, and she just has this really interesting way of looking at the world. And I love them both so much. And I can see why there's all this lore about them. I think there's that book that came out recently that explores some letters that were written between the two of them. Like, they're both really, really interesting points of view onto a similar culture and a similar time. Babbitts is just so fun, like laugh out loud funny. The way she views the world is so fun. I can't wait to read more from her. I don't know if I'm really that interested, similar to Didion. Like, I don't really know if I care to read their novels. But I really, really am just so looking forward to reading more of their essays and just their think pieces. Like, I find them fascinating. They have this effortless charm about them both in the way that they view the world and they write it. And it's just so honest, but in very different ways. They're just so fun to read, and especially Babbitts. I really, really enjoyed this collection. I haven't had a lot of 5-star books this year. I think the only book I actually fully gave 5 stars was the last book in the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. However, these next two have come like the closest. There's always something stopping me from giving them a full 5-star, but they're still absolutely incredible books. The first one of these is Empire of Pain by Patrick Ryan Keefe. This is the story of the Sackler family who took over Purdue Pharma and created OxyContin, and as such are directly responsible for the crisis in the US and many other parts in the world, the opiate crisis. This was fascinating. Like, this is really at its heart a family saga, but it was so insightful because you realize how these people were raised and how they view the world, and you see the impact that that has on the way they run their companies. And it kind of just helps put things into perspective. There's also obviously a lot of like family, romantic, interpersonal drama, and while you would think that you don't really care, Patrick Ryan Keefe manages to write it in a way that you do care. Patrick Ryan Keefe is the author of Say Nothing, which is one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time. I thought it was just brilliantly written, and he kind of manages to strike gold here again. He has such a way of writing that makes you so engaged and compelled without bogging you down with details. He does this thing really well where if he's introduced someone or something earlier in the book and then he circles back to it, he always adds like a brief description beside it so that you never feel truly lost. And it's one of those things that I didn't realize I was missing from nonfiction until I saw it done. He doesn't do it in a way that's overdone, like it's not too often, but really it's like when something was introduced quite early on and then brought back up again towards the end of the book, and you're like, you read the name and you're like, oh, and then he gives like, you know, comma, blah, 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 comma, and continues with the story. It's like, okay, you're kind of resituated. And it's like those small touches he does when he writes are just so incredibly useful and appreciated, and I really, really like how he narrates things. He has such an easy tone and it just makes you want to read it. I find his books are very, very like consumable, but also just really interesting while also being kind of tragic. I really, really love him. I think he's a phenomenal author, so I really, really enjoyed this. And the final book I want to talk about here is a book that I've been reading for a long time. Guys, I did it. I finished The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, and I loved it. This is the classic revenge story. Edmond Dantes is a young sailor who has his whole life ahead of him, but a few jealous men have him thrown into jail for like 19 years of his life. And when he gets out, he is like, I've got a little black book and I'm going after every one of you bitches and making your life miserable. And he does he ever. This was so good. This was so good. It's crazy because sometimes you read a classic and you're like, I get why it's a classic, but it's not fun. Like, I don't know why people read this for fun. This is fun. Once shit hits the fan, once the plot unravels, you are like kicking your feet screaming because shit's just hitting the fan. Like, it's so fun. I love though that it also had those really tender and insightful and heartbreaking moments while also just being really like high octane drama. There's a serial killer, there's like secret babies and affairs, there's just like so much shit. There is love confessions and there is poisoners and there's so much shit going on. There's just so much shit going on. It's just so off the rails and so much fun. And through it all, you have Edmond Dantes acting as the Count of Monte Cristo, and it's just fucking fascinating. So fun to watch him execute his revenge plot. So fun to see the things he comes up with. He's so extravagant. He's so over the top. And yet sometimes you still see the broken boy inside of him and it just breaks your heart. It's just phenomenally done. Like, I loved almost everything about this. There's a section in the middle that just slogs a lot, and that's where I gave up last time I read this book, and that's where a lot of people tend to give up because the beginning is so intense, right? He's on this high, he gets thrown into jail, he meets someone in jail, he tries to make a plan to break out of jail, and you're like along for the ride, and then it just kind of slows. When I tell you it's worth it to read through, it's worth it. I also really recommend this translation. I believe this is the Robin Buss translation. I had a different one and I found it a little bit harder to read. This one's beautiful. The tone in this is almost at times like campy theatrical, almost like Oscar Wilde. Like, it's witty and it's kind of exaggerated, but it's still very like consistent with the kind of drama of it all. Anyways, I love this so much. It worked so well for me. It was intimidating as hell, but I managed to get my way through it. And this is a book that I would just picture myself coming back to over and over because it's such a beloved story to me now. I've spent so much time with these characters. I've spent so much time in this world and this plot. And I love it so much. That was a few things that I have read recently. And now I'd love to know what you have read recently. If I missed anything good while I've been sporadically posting and not posting. Other than that, I have my social media link down below if you guys want to come talk to me there. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for sticking around, and I will see you soon, I promise. Bye.